Hi, and welcome to the second in a series of mini discussions on the struggle for the vote in American history, presented by Fairmount Community Library's YouTube station in both acknowledgement of the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment and the presidential election happening in 2 weeks. I apologize, this video is a couple of weeks late due to the fact that I had to have two emergency dental surgeries in the past week. So that was a fun week. But if you'd like, I'm hoping that today we could have a small, short, just kind of discussion on the struggle for the abolition of racial qualifications for the vote in American history. To start with, I think it might be best to understand what exactly we mean when we say by racial qualifications. Basically, at various times in the history of the United States, various states found ways, in some sense very creative ways, but also really horrible ways, to deny the vote both at the state level and the federal level to people who were seen as belonging to particular races. And that actually brings up a great point to kind of focus on for a moment, which what do we mean by race? For the purposes of this discussion, what I'd like to suggest is that race is an ideology of social identity, so that various people seen as so that most recent medical scholarship argues that race isn't a biological reality, but is in fact a socially constructed reality, which means that racial populations have been created by various forces, economic, political, intellectual, cultural, throughout history, without there actually being a biological reality when we use the term race. So that race is not exactly so that race is an ideology, a way we view the world, and a way we perceive other people, but it doesn't really have a lot to do with medical science as we understand this. This approach to the social constructive race is roughly over a century old, and one of the fundamental people to begin working on it was Franz Boas, who was an anthropologist in the early 20th century America. He was from Germany, but he was a anthropologist in America in the early 20th century. So the way race was constructed in early America in the 19th, the 18th, and the 19th century, and even for part of the 17th century, were that people with different skin pigmentations were seen as belonging to different races, also different geographical areas, so that people with various levels of uh, melanin in their skins were perceived, even though that there was no really radically medical differentiation between various populations, they were seen as belonging to certain races. And again, since race was an ideology and not really scientific fact, the problem was that who belonged to what race would change over various periods of time. For instance, Benjamin Franklin in I believe it was the 1760s argued that Swedish people did not belong to the white race, which was, of course, in his mind, Anglo-Saxon, the people from England who had settled the American colonies. So again, I want to hold on to that idea of race being, although sometime, and again, this isn't to say that race wasn't at times a deadly reality, but that the way it was constructed changed over time due to various historical circumstances. So, what I'd like to then draw kind of now that we kind of roughly understand race as a way of seeing reality created, is an ideological way of perceiving reality and perceiving someone's identity through this particular thought process. I'd like to kind of move back then towards what we were discussing the last video, which was the fact that race as a that race or was one way of separating populations. And so in the last video we looked at how the uh, the people who were seen as somewhat of a threat to property interests and were denied the vote until they were, kind of had their right approach to property were, kind of workers and lower class. And the problem with race is that it was used as a way to kind of a shorthand for understanding people who, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, and in the 19th century, race was one way to sort out the populations between who could be enslaved and who couldn't be enslaved. And slavery was an important labor force especially in the Caribbean and the southern colonies. And so race was a way to discipline that particular labor force, because race was tied to the civic status of people who could be enslaved. So, beginning in the 1790s, because again, as we looked at the Constitution was kind of a uh, bargaining process in which various interests agreed on who could not wield the power of the vote. Uh, they kept that at the state level. So while in the northern states where slavery was dying out, there was a growing a bit there in the early right after the revolution and roughly till the 1820s, 1830s, there was a movement towards um, extending the right of vote to people who were considered, quote, racially black. This, however, in the North began to change due to the rise of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, again, because of the way the American party system is set up, is basically a concentration of diverse interests. And in the North, the Democratic Party became the working class immigrant interest, but in the South, it became part of the planter interests, the people who were in charge of the plantations and for whom slavery and being able to hold power over their slaves was very powerful. So you see that, this kind of ironically that in the South where workers could be enslaved, the bosses or masters held power. And so they formed alliance with the workers in the North for political reasons against the bosses in the North. And this planter labor alliance, which became the Jacksonian Democratic Party, and fought for, quote, white workers' um, right to vote, very differed uh, did was actually against all working people being able to vote who were considered African Americans, or uh, actually at the time they were considered black. So this process then kind of exploded with with the Civil War, in which we had seen this growth of among all economic classes, free white men being able to vote. But then during the Civil War, where the southern colonies wanting to protect, or the southern states wanting to protect their institution of slavery as as a way to control and extract labor from their working class, um, was worried that the as abolitionist sentiment grew in the North, that slavery would be in danger, so they attempted to leave the Union when an anti-slavery president was elected, Abraham Lincoln, on the Republicans. Um, this led to a bloody civil war in which one of the reasons the Union was able to triumph was that it was able to form an alliance with the enslaved in the southern states of rebellion, who became soldiers, and also in running to in escaping to freedom in the Union lines, were able to destroy the economic structure of the South. So, in achieving their freedom, enslaved African Americans of the period also proved, their ability to have citizenship. And in fact, one of the reasons John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in Ford's Theater in 1865 at the end of the war was a few days before that. Lincoln had given a speech in which he'd come out in favor for the right of the vote for African Americans who had served in the military. And even General Sherman, who wasn't exactly what we would call today a racial progressive, felt that if you had fought for the Union, you in some way deserved the right to vote. So what we have, and some scholars refer to this period as the Second American Revolution, is that after Lincoln was shot, and some of the Republicans who had supported the Union and the northern states during the war, joined forces with various abolitionist groups and African American groups, and formed a strong movement, especially since the military was in control of the southern states, to uh, push through the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted birthright citizenship to all individuals born in the United States, and thirdly, the 15th Amendment, which would would give the right to vote to all American men, regardless of race. And there was a major struggle because the states, since the military was in control of the southern states, and there were these new governments after the military defeat of the Confederate States. There were these new governments that pushed through their uh, these amendments, so that by 1870 slavery was abolished, uh, birthright citizenship was granted, and again the vote could not be denied. Uh, the vote could not be denied by right of someone's race. The problem was that the federal this was a revolutionary step for the federal government, because, as we saw the last time, the states had the power to decide who and who couldn't vote, and this was the federal government, which was part of a larger uh, kind of process in uh, the the Europe and the United States and South America at this time, the growth of nationalism, and that kind of national governments became more and more powerful, and this was seen as a major evolution of federal and national power, in that the federal government would decide who could and could not vote. And that the right to vote could not be taken away on account of someone's, quote, race. The problem was with this is that the federal government on the ground was able to enforce this until the northern politicians and the vast majority of northern citizens grew tired of the kind of military commitment we could that would be necessary to ensure that African Americans had this right to vote. So what happened was that there was kind of in the North a slackening or and also a fear that if the federal government would become too powerful, it instead of just uh, fighting for racial rights, it might fight for other rights like the right for labor unions, or uh, impinge itself on property rights. So you had and in the South, the ex-Confederates, who, as one historian has called them, ex-Confederate extremists, almost waged what is basically a civil war after the Southern Civil War, after the original Civil War between the Union and the Confederacy, using violence and terror. They basically it's once the United States military, because the other thing is the United States military at the same time were fighting the Native American resistance in the West and trying to extend America's imperial reach across the continent. So they were fighting, so they were kind of fighting for national economic interests on two fronts, the South and the North. And again, that would cost money and sweat and blood from the North. So the Northern interests just didn't want another 15, 20 years of basically domesticating the South into this uh, national community of voters of voters that in which race would not be an obstacle to the vote. So this growing violence led in during the 1876 and 1877 to a compromise between the Democratic Party, which had a lot of ties to the again the uh, ex-Confederate extremists in the South, and the Republican Party, who had attempted to maintain that radical Republican commitment to voting rights for all men, regardless of race. The problem was, so in an attempt to and an attempt to concentrate, especially the economic forces of capital, on what the economic forces of capital saw as being much more important, which was moving west and making sure that there were new settlements and new markets in the West, that as long as there was peace in the South, the Northern interests were willing to sacrifice the right for African Americans to vote. This so that and then once the military left, there was still a period where African Americans were able to exercise the vote, but as these Confederate extremists, who were kind of the planter class, and their followers before the war, wanted to basically regain both their political and economic power, so that slowly during the 1890s, especially after the growth of the populist movement, which was a biracial movement by poor Southern and Western tenant farmers and farmers to gain economic justice and political power, uh, Southerners began to push for white Southerners began to push for for the exclusion of what they call of what they of African Americans from the right to vote. This, unfortunately, was deeply also a violent process, especially in North Carolina, where there was basically 4 or 5 days of violence against a populist influenced state government, basically just the Democratic forces, which were again the forces of the traditional planter merchant class and their followers, basically just started killing people until they were able to gain the power back. So that basically what we have in the 1950s, or I'm sorry, in the 1860s and 70s, is this kind of revolutionary moment where it seemed that there was a real possibility that we could have, again, understanding race as an ideology of social identity, a democratic biracial movement a uh, for a uh, I'm sorry, it's been a long day, uh, but a biracial movement for a democracy. And so uh, we finally are moving, we were moving in that direction, but again, interests, the power interests of the moderate Republicans and capital and military interests in the North all didn't felt, unfortunately, that the military commitment to protecting African Americans' right to vote was just not as important as pushing for the pacification of Native American resistance in the West and controlling labor unrest in the North. So what you had was once the and it was a process over decades, but what you have was once the federal troops pulled out of the South in the late 1870s, in the middle to late 1870s, a strong movement by local white elites to destroy destroy the right of African Americans in the South to vote, African American men, and also in some cases poor white men who would have formed kind of a cross racial alliance to improve their standing too. I think what I might do, I think at this point, so that by the 1900, again, we have women being, not being able to vote. Although there's a rare exception, I believe it was Wyoming at the state level, women could vote. But other than that, women couldn't vote. In 1900, most African Americans in the South couldn't vote, and we had white men. Again, not in every case, but majority of white men being able to vote. So I think what I'm going to do, I was going to plan for just three short discussions, but I think what I'm going to do is concentrate next time we talk on the struggle for the women's vote, and then we'll look at the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Amendment. So kind of do this more chronologically, and bump this up to four to a series of four videos. But thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I would just like to add that I've had some really, really, really great uh, books that have been helpful in preparing this. Uh, Three specifically, I can't recommend enough. The Right to Vote: A History of the Struggle to Vote by Alexander Kaser of Harvard University. Racecraft by Dr. Barbara Fields and Dr. Karen Fields. Dr. Barbara Fields of Columbia was on Ken Burns' Civil War documentary series about 30 years ago and is a huge figure in American history. And then Toward Freedom by Dr. Touré Reed of Illinois State, who discusses the 20th century, which I'm going to eventually talk about in the fourth video, the 20th century African American struggle, not just for voting rights, but for equality on various levels. So I really recommend these three books. Thank you for your time, and please, please. I know it's a very difficult time right now, but it's also a difficult and critical time for our democracy. So please, get out and vote in the next couple of weeks, because I know we're either they're doing mail-in ballots and they're holding various days of voting. So I hope if this lecture has done anything, it's shown how important the right to vote is, and kind of the 200-year struggle, unrelenting struggle, so that all Americans can have it. So in that light, I really do hope that it motivates all of you to vote. And I look forward, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And thank you for your time. And be safe, be sane, and be voting. Have a great night. Bye.